September 1945. A canvas tent on Okinawa. The air is thick with salt and smoke. Outside, the island still smells like war, scorched coral, gasoline, death baked into the soil. Inside, a young Japanese woman sits on a folding chair, hands clasped in her lap, spine rigid. Her name is Kimiko. She is 23 years old. She has not slept in 4 days. Across from her, 3 American soldiers stand near a field table. One of them is holding a canteen. Another is rolling a cigarette. The third says something in English. She doesn't understand the words, and suddenly, all 3 are laughing. Not the laughter of victors over the defeated. Not the laughter of men about to do something terrible. Just laughter. Kimiko's breath catches. Her hands begin to shake. She does not understand what is happening. She was told Americans were demons. She was told surrender meant torture, humiliation, death. She was told that, if she were ever captured, she should take her own life before they could take it from her. But no one told her they would laugh. To understand what Kimiko is experiencing in that tent, you must first understand what she was taught to believe. In Imperial Japan, surrender was not simply defeat. It was annihilation of the soul. The military code, Senjinkan, issued in 1941, explicitly forbade Japanese soldiers from being taken alive. Do not suffer the shame of capture. It commanded, die with honor rather than live in disgrace. This was not metaphor. This was doctrine. From childhood, Japanese citizens were indoctrinated into a worldview where the emperor was divine, where Japan's war was sacred, and where the enemy, particularly the Americans, were subhuman barbarians. Propaganda posters depicted US soldiers as horned demons with fangs. Radio broadcasts described atrocities, Americans who tortured prisoners, mutilated bodies, desecrated the dead. School children were taught that capture meant rape, dismemberment, slow death. Women were not exempt from this conditioning. If anything, they were given an even darker vision. Japanese military nurses, civilian auxiliaries, and women trapped on occupied islands were told that American soldiers would do unspeakable things to them. Better to die by your own hand. Better to take your children with you. This belief was so deeply embedded that during the fall of Saipan in July 1944, thousands of Japanese civilians, many of them women and children, threw themselves off cliffs rather than face capture. Mothers clutched infants as they jumped. Teenagers held hands and leapt together. American soldiers, watching from below, could do nothing but stare in horror. It became known as Suicide Cliff, and it was not an isolated incident. By 1945, this pattern had repeated across the Pacific, Tinian, Guam, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Everywhere American forces advanced, they found not just military resistance, but mass civilian death driven by terror of what capture would mean. Kimiko had heard the stories. She had believed them. Everyone did. But by the autumn of 1945, the war was over. Japan had surrendered, and for the first time in the Pacific conflict, large numbers of Japanese civilians and soldiers were being taken into American custody, not as bodies, but as living prisoners. The scale was unprecedented. On Okinawa alone, more than 10,000 Japanese civilians had been captured or had emerged from hiding after the island fell in June 1945. Across the Pacific theater, tens of thousands more, soldiers who had laid down arms, nurses who had survived field hospitals, families who had been stranded on occupied islands, were now in American hands. For the United States military, this presented a logistical and moral challenge. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners of war. American doctrine emphasized it. But how do you care for people who have been taught to fear you more than death itself? Japanese prisoners arrived in Allied camps expecting execution. Some refused food, believing it was poisoned. Others sat in silence, waiting for the torture to begin. Many were shocked simply to be alive. Kimiko had been working as a nurse's aide on Okinawa when the island fell. She had watched the Japanese defensive line collapse. She had seen soldiers commit seppuku rather than retreat. She had been told by her commanding officer that if the Americans came, she should use the scalpel in her medical kit on herself. But when the Americans came, they came with stretchers, with medics, with interpreters who said, in halting Japanese, "You are safe now. No one will hurt you." She did not believe them. How could she? And then they brought her to the tent, gave her water, gave her a blanket, and one of the soldiers, a boy, really, no older than her younger brother, offered her a piece of chocolate. She stared at it like it was a weapon. Outside, she could hear voices, laughter, the sound of men who were not afraid, not angry, just alive. It made no sense. None of it made sense. And that was when her world began to crack. What Kimiko was experiencing was not simply culture shock. It was the collapse of an entire cosmology. She had been raised in a society where hierarchy was absolute, where obedience was virtue, where the relationship between victor and vanquished was defined by domination. In Japanese military culture, prisoners were beneath contempt. To surrender was to cease being human. Japanese forces had treated allied POWs accordingly, with starvation, forced labor, casual brutality. It was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was the logical extension of a belief system. If you surrender, you have forfeited your right to dignity. So when Kimiko saw American soldiers treating Japanese prisoners, not with contempt, but with indifference to their shame, it shattered the framework through which she understood the world. She watched them distribute rations equally. She watched them provide medical care without distinction between American wounded and Japanese. She watched them speak to prisoners not as subhumans, but as men who had lost a war, and she watched them laugh not at the prisoners, just near them, with them, sometimes, the casual, thoughtless laughter of soldiers far from home, killing time, telling jokes, being human. For Kimiko, this was incomprehensible. How could enemies laugh together? How could captors treat captives with anything other than vengeance? The Americans, for their part, were simply following orders. The United States military had clear directives regarding POW treatment: feed them, house them, provide medical care, process them through interrogation with respect and minimal coercion. It was policy. It was also, for many American soldiers, simply common sense. Most of the men guarding Japanese prisoners in the Pacific were not professional soldiers. They were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California. They had seen terrible things. They had fought in jungles where the enemy refused to surrender, where booby traps killed indiscriminately, where wounded Japanese soldiers detonated grenades rather than accept aid. But the war was over now, and these prisoners, many of them starving, sick, shell-shocked, posed no threat. So the Americans did what seemed natural. They shared cigarettes. They played cards in view of the prisoners. They made jokes to pass the time. Between the Americans and the Japanese prisoners stood a small group of men who understood both worlds. The Nisei interpreters. These were second-generation Japanese Americans, many of whom had been pulled from internment camps in the United States and recruited into military intelligence. They spoke Japanese fluently, they understood the culture, and they found themselves in the strange position of explaining America to people who believed Americans were monsters. One interpreter, a young man, Takeshi Yamamoto, later recalled the first time he tried to convince a group of Japanese prisoners that they would not be executed. They didn't believe me, he said. They thought I was lying to make their deaths easier. One man asked me, "Why do you serve demons?" I told him, "Because they're not demons. They're just soldiers." He looked at me like I had betrayed everything. The interpreters had to translate more than words. They had to translate intent. When an American medic treated a wounded Japanese soldier, the interpreters explained that this was not a trick. This was simply what medics did. When American guards allowed prisoners to write letters home, the interpreters explained that these letters would actually be sent, not burned. Slowly, over days and weeks, the message began to sink in. Kimiko watched this process unfold. She saw Japanese soldiers, men who had been prepared to die, begin to accept food, begin to speak, Begin to ask questions. And she saw something else. She saw the interpreters themselves, Japanese faces in American uniforms, living proof that the world was more complicated than propaganda allowed. For Kimiko and the other Japanese women in American custody, the most destabilizing realization was not that Americans were kind. It was that they had been lied to. Everything she had been taught about American brutality, about the righteousness of Japan's cause, about the necessity of death over dishonor, had been constructed on a foundation of lies. If Americans were not demons, then what did that make the war? If surrender did not mean torture, then what about the thousands who had died rather than be captured? If enemy soldiers could show mercy, then what did that say about her own side? These were not questions Kimiko could speak aloud, not yet, but they lived in her chest like a weight, pressing down every time she saw an American soldier offer water to a Japanese prisoner. Every time she heard laughter instead of screams, she began to notice other women experiencing the same crisis. A nurse who had expected rape and received a blanket. A mother who had prepared to kill her children and was instead given milk for them. They did not speak of it directly, but their eyes told the story. We were wrong about everything. The moment came on a Tuesday afternoon. 3 weeks into Kimiko's captivity, she was sitting outside the women's barracks, a cluster of tents near the airfield, when she saw it happen. A Japanese prisoner, a former soldier named Tanaka, was being escorted across the compound by an American guard. The guard was young, maybe 19, with red hair and freckles across his sunburned nose. They stopped near a supply crate. The guard reached into his pocket, pulled out a pack of cigarettes, and offered one to Tanaka. Tanaka stared at the cigarette, then at the guard, then back at the cigarette. He took it. The guard struck a match, lit his own cigarette first, then held the flame out for Tanaka. The Japanese man leaned forward, hands trembling, and lit the cigarette from the American's match. They stood there for a moment, two men smoking in the sun. The guard said something in English. Tanaka didn't understand, but he nodded anyway. The guard smiled, not a cruel smile, not a mocking smile, just the tired smile of a man grateful for a cigarette break. And then he said something else, and Tanaka, inexplicably, smiled back. Kimiko watched this exchange from 30 feet away, and something inside her broke. She began to cry, not quietly, not the silent tears of a woman trying to maintain dignity. She wept, body shaking, hands covering her face, unable to stop. Another woman, an older nurse named Hoshino, came and sat beside her. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't need to. She had seen the same thing. She was crying too. They told us, Kimiko whispered. They told us the Americans would burn us alive. Hoshino nodded. Her voice was hoarse. They told us we would beg for death. They told us we would never see home again. They told us many things. Across the compound, the American guard finished his cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and gestured for Tanaka to follow. Tanaka went without resistance, without fear, just a man walking beside another man under the Pacific sun. Kimiko watched them disappear around a corner, and she realized she had never seen a Japanese officer share a cigarette with an enlisted man. Not once, not ever. The next day, Kimiko volunteered to help in the camp medical tent. She didn't know why she did it. Perhaps because sitting still had become unbearable. Perhaps because the American doctors needed extra hands. Perhaps because she needed to see for herself, up close, whether what she was witnessing was real. The medical tent smelled like antiseptic and canvas. There were rows of cots, Americans on one side, Japanese on the other. A tall, thin medic named Patterson was moving between them, checking wounds, distributing medication, speaking in a calm, steady voice. Even though most of his patients couldn't understand him, Kimiko stood in the entrance, uncertain. Patterson looked up, saw her, and waved her over. He pointed to a Japanese soldier on a cot, a man with bandages wrapped around his torso, his face grey with pain. "Can you ask him where it hurts?" Patterson said slowly, gesturing to his own chest. Kimiko approached the wounded man. She knelt beside the cot and spoke softly in Japanese. The American doctor wants to know where you feel pain. The soldier's eyes widened. He stared at her as if she were a ghost. You work for them. I help translate. They'll kill me, the man whispered. They're waiting until I'm strong enough to torture. Kimiko looked back at Patterson, who was preparing a syringe, morphine, she realized. For pain relief. No, she said quietly. They won't. The soldier didn't believe her. She could see it in his eyes. So she stayed beside him as Patterson administered the injection, as the morphine took hold, as the man's breathing slowed and the agony drained from his face. He looked up at her, confused. Why? She had no answer. Over the following weeks, Kimiko became a fixture in the medical tent. She translated symptoms, calmed terrified patients, helped distribute food. She watched American medics treat Japanese soldiers with the same care they gave their own wounded. She watched them work through exhaustion, through supply shortages, through the grinding tedium of post-war occupation, and she watched the other Japanese women begin to change. Some started teaching basic Japanese phrases to American soldiers. Others helped organize the prisoner barracks, distributed Red Cross packages, wrote letters for men too injured to hold a pen. It was not collaboration in the treasonous sense. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. But it was a quiet, undeniable shift. They were no longer waiting to die. They were participating in survival. One evening, Kimiko overheard two American soldiers talking outside the mess tent. One of them was complaining about the food. The other made a joke about the cook. They both laughed. That same casual, meaningless laughter she had heard on her first day. But this time, she understood it. It wasn't the laughter of cruelty. It wasn't the laughter of dominance. It was the laughter of men who had been given a job they didn't particularly want, in a place they didn't want to be, dealing with people they didn't hate. It was the laughter of human beings refusing to be defined entirely by war. And in that moment, Kimiko realized the lies had not just been about Americans. They had been about what it meant to be human. By the time Kimiko was repatriated to Japan in early 1946, she had spent 5 months in American custody. She returned to a country that no longer existed, not in the way she remembered it. Tokyo was ash and rubble. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were names that now meant something unspeakable. The emperor had spoken on the radio, his voice thin and mortal, announcing surrender. The divine had become human. The unthinkable had become history. Kimiko's family had survived. Her father, a schoolteacher, had lost his position. Her mother grew vegetables in the ruins of their neighborhood. Her younger brother had died on Okinawa, the same island where Kimiko had been captured. They did not speak of him often. When people asked Kimiko what the Americans had done to her, she told the truth. They had fed her, given her medical care, treated her with indifference that felt, in retrospect, like mercy. Most people didn't believe her. You're lucky, they said. You must have been lucky. She didn't argue. How could she explain that it wasn't luck, that it was policy, that the Americans had treated thousands of Japanese prisoners the same way, not because they were soft, but because they believed in something that Japanese military culture did not, that even enemies deserved a baseline of human dignity. The numbers told the story. Of the tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners held in American custody during and after the war, the survival rate was over 98%. Prisoners received adequate food, medical care, and shelter. Many gained weight in captivity. Some later described their time as POWs as the first period of safety they had experienced in years. This stood in stark, brutal contrast to the other side of the ledger. Of the approximately 140,000 Allied prisoners held by Japanese forces during the war, more than 27% died in captivity. In some camps, the death rate exceeded 50%. Prisoners were starved, beaten, forced into slave labor, executed for minor infractions. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, Unit 731.K. These facts. Even if she didn't yet know the full scope, she had worked in field hospitals. She had seen how Japanese soldiers treated captured enemies, not as prisoners, but as broken things beneath contempt. The testimonies came slowly, Over years. In the 1950s and 1960s, as Japan rebuilt and began to reckon with its wartime past, former prisoners, both Japanese who had been held by Americans and the rare Allied survivors of Japanese camps, began to speak publicly. Their accounts painted two radically different pictures of captivity. A former Japanese soldier named Hiroshi Matsumoto, captured on Luzon in 1945, wrote in his memoir, "I expected to be killed within hours. Instead, they gave me rice and let me sleep. When I woke, I thought I had died and gone to some strange afterlife where Americans were kind." Another man, a civilian caught on Saipan, described his shock at seeing American guards playing baseball with Japanese prisoners. "They threw the ball to us," he wrote. "They taught us the rules. I had never played a game with my own officers, but here, the enemy was inviting me to play. These were not isolated experiences. They were systematic." The United States military had calculated that humane treatment of POWs served strategic purposes. It encouraged surrender, reduced resistance, and facilitated intelligence gathering. But it was also rooted in a legal and moral framework that Japanese military doctrine lacked. The Japanese military code had no equivalent to the Geneva Convention. Surrender was not a legal status, it was a spiritual failure. And so, captured enemies were not prisoners of war deserving of protection. They were dishonored wretches who had forfeited their humanity. For women like Kimiko, who had witnessed both systems firsthand, the moral dissonance never fully resolved. She spent the rest of her life in Yokohama, working as a translator for the American occupation forces, then later for a trading company. She married, had children, told them very little about the war, but in 1982, when she was 60 years old, she gave an interview to a Japanese historian researching civilian experiences of the war's end. "The hardest thing," she said, "was coming home and realizing that the people who had lied to us about the enemy, about surrender, about what honor meant, were never punished. They simply became bureaucrats and businessmen, and we were left to live with what they had made us believe." She paused, then added, "But I will tell you this, I saw Americans laugh with men they had every reason to hate, and I have never forgotten it. That memory kept me human when everything else said I shouldn't be. War does not end when the guns fall silent. It ends in moments like the one Kimiko witnessed, a cigarette shared between enemies, a laugh that means nothing and everything, a medic who treats a wound without asking whose side it belonged to." The Japanese women who passed through American custody in 1945 had been prepared for death. They had been taught that capture was worse than dying, that the enemy was inhuman, that mercy was weakness and surrender was erasure. What they were not prepared for was kindness, not grand gestures or speeches about liberation, just the small, thoughtless acts of soldiers being decent because decency was expected of them. That laughter Kimiko heard in the tent was not strategic. It was not propaganda. It was the sound of men who refused to let war consume every part of who they were. And in refusing, they dismantled an entire architecture of lies. The women who witnessed it carried that knowledge home. Some spoke of it. Most did not, but they knew. They had seen the enemy's face, and it looked disturbingly, uncomfortably human. Perhaps that is the most dangerous thing one person can do to another's hatred. Not defeat it with force, but disarm it with unexpected grace. The war ended. The lies did not. But for those women, in those tents, on those islands, something irreversible occurred. They had been told the world was one way, and then they saw it was another. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it.